Part 1, 1619, The First Africans in America. Imagine a hot August afternoon in the year 1619. Off the coast of Virginia, a small English settlement called Point Comfort, not far from today's Hampton, sits quietly by the water. The colonists are tired, sunburned, and struggling to survive. The tobacco fields stretch toward the horizon, worked by indentured servants, mostly poor Englishmen who traded years of labor for the promise of freedom. Life is harsh, uncertain, and short. But that summer, a ship sails into view carrying something that will forever change the course of American history. The vessel is called the White Lion, an English privateer, a kind of pirate with government permission to attack Spanish and Portuguese ships. On board are about 20 African men and women, captured from a Portuguese slave ship, the São João Bautista, which had originally been bound for Mexico. These Africans were taken during a raid in the Caribbean and brought north to Virginia to be traded for food and supplies. When they stepped off that ship, they became the first recorded Africans in English North America. The colonists didn't yet have a formal system of slavery. In 1619, Virginia was still young, just 12 years old, and its economy was barely functioning. At that time, laborers were often bound by indenture. They worked for a certain number of years in exchange for passage across the Atlantic, room, and food. After their term was done, they were free. So when these first Africans arrived, they were treated, at least on paper, like indentured servants too. But the difference was already clear. Freedom was not something the colonists intended to grant them easily. Who were these first Africans? They came from the Ndongo kingdom in what is now Angola. Their homeland was rich in culture, music, and traditions. Many were farmers, artisans, and warriors. The Portuguese had invaded their lands and captured thousands of people, chaining them together and forcing them toward the coast. From there, they were crammed into slave ships bound for the Americas. The journey across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, was a nightmare. Disease, starvation, and brutality claimed countless lives. Historians estimate that only about 2/3 of those captured survived the voyage. For those who reached Virginia, the nightmare didn't end, it only changed shape. The Africans brought to Point Comfort were traded for food and supplies and then sent to different plantations across the colony. Their names were rarely recorded. Only a few, like Anthony and Isabella, Angela, or Mary, appear in the surviving documents. These faint traces are all that's left of their arrival, yet their presence marked the beginning of a system that would define America for centuries. At this time, English colonists saw themselves as Christians and free subjects of the crown. They didn't yet have clear laws defining slavery, but racial attitudes were already forming. To the colonists, Africans looked and sounded different, their religion was different, and their language was unfamiliar. The colonists began to justify treating them as others, as people meant for endless labor. Still, in the 1620s and 1630s, Virginia was a place of legal ambiguity. Some Africans, like Anthony Johnson, who arrived around 1621, eventually gained freedom, bought land, and even owned servants themselves. But their position was fragile. Within a few decades, the colony would write new laws that made blackness itself a mark of bondage. In 1619, however, no one could yet see the full shape of what was coming. The colonists were simply trying to survive. The tobacco industry was growing fast, and every hand in the field meant more profit. Englishmen who once did the work themselves began to dream of a system that would give them labor without limit, and without cost. The first Africans, stripped of their homeland, language, and family, became the seeds of that cruel idea. Let's step back for a moment and imagine the world they left behind. In West Central Africa, the Ndongo people lived in vibrant villages, farming cassava and millet, raising cattle, and trading in iron and ivory. Their kingdom had rulers, nobles, and spiritual leaders. They had families, songs, and rituals for harvest and birth. The arrival of Portuguese slave traders in the late 1500s brought war and chaos. Raids by rival tribes, fueled by European guns and greed, tore communities apart. Those captured were marched in chains for miles to the coast, where they were branded, sold, and forced onto ships. For weeks or months, they lay in the dark hold, barely able to move. The air was thick with the stench of death and despair. To survive such a journey was a miracle. To arrive in Virginia, a cold, foreign world with strange customs and languages, was another kind of trial. Imagine the shock of seeing tall, pale-skinned strangers in armor, speaking words that meant nothing, pointing toward endless fields of green tobacco. Imagine realizing that you were no longer a person in their eyes, but property. Life in the early Virginia colony was brutal for everyone. Hunger, disease, and violence were part of daily life. The colony had nearly failed several times before. But by 1619, tobacco had turned things around. The crop was called brown gold, and it was in high demand in England. Yet tobacco was also labor-intensive. Planting, tending, drying, packing, and shipping all required endless hands. The more land you owned, the richer you could become. But without workers, the dream collapsed. So, colonists turned to anyone they could exploit, first poor Englishmen, then indigenous captives, and finally Africans. Over time, they realized that Africans could not easily blend into English society or escape into nearby native communities. That realization hardened into policy. By the mid-1600s, laws began to say openly that Africans were slaves for life, and that their children would inherit that status. But in 1619, none of that was written yet. The first Africans lived in the shadow of uncertainty, between servitude and slavery, between freedom and captivity. Some worked the land, some tended animals, others cooked or built. A few learned English and even converted to Christianity. But always, they were watched, controlled, and treated as lesser beings. That same year, 1619, brought other events that would define America. The House of Burgesses, the first representative assembly in English America, met in Jamestown. It was the birth of democratic self-government on American soil. At the very same time, the first Africans were being sold into forced labor nearby. Two beginnings, freedom and slavery, were born side by side. That irony is the heart of America's story. Think about it, in one summer, the seeds of liberty and the seeds of bondage were planted together. The same land that spoke of self-rule and individual rights also built its wealth on human suffering. The two would grow together for generations, twisting around each other like vines, impossible to separate, each shaping the nation that would come. For those first Africans, there was no written history, only fragments. A baptismal record here, a land document there, a single name in a shipping manifest. But their legacy is immense. They were the beginning of a people who would endure centuries of oppression and still create a culture of resilience, faith, and hope. From the moment their feet touched Virginia soil, they became part of the American story, not by choice, but by fate. In this first part of our story, we've seen how slavery in America did not begin overnight. It began quietly, with a ship, a trade, and a few dozen people torn from their world. It began with uncertainty, rationalization, and greed. And it began alongside the birth of freedom itself, a contradiction that would haunt America for centuries. In the next chapter, we'll see how this fragile beginning hardened into law. We'll follow the rise of racial slavery, the codification of bondage, and the creation of a society built on inequality. But for now, remember the faces on that ship, the men and women who survived the Middle Passage and stepped into the unknown. Their arrival marked not just the start of slavery in English America, it marked the first turning point in the long and painful journey toward freedom. Part 2, The Rise of Racial Slavery in Colonial America. By the middle of the 1600s, the colony of Virginia no longer looked like the fragile settlement it had been in 1619. Tobacco fields rolled across the landscape, and ships regularly crossed the Atlantic, bringing goods, tools, and, most importantly for the planters, laborers. The early system of indentured servitude had filled the fields for decades, with poor Englishmen and Irishmen working side by side with Africans. But slowly, something changed. This new Virginia, richer, more ambitious, and more self-confident, was starting to build its social order on race. Let's start with a story. In 1640, a man named John Punch, an African servant, ran away from his master along with 2 white servants. The 3 men were caught and brought before the colonial court. The white servants were punished with a few extra years added to their contracts. But John Punch was sentenced to serve for the rest of his life. This was the first recorded legal distinction between black and white labor in English America, a seed from which a monstrous tree would grow. At that moment, the colony made a silent decision: skin color could determine destiny. During the 1640s and 1650s, the English colonies began to formalize what had once been a blurry line. The legal documents, property records, and church registers of the time reveal an emerging pattern: African workers were staying enslaved for life, while European servants were eventually freed. The system was shifting, quietly but decisively, toward racial slavery. One of the most striking examples of this transformation is the story of Anthony Johnson, the man who had once been a servant himself. After earning his freedom, he acquired land, built a farm, and even owned a few indentured servants, both black and white. For a time, he lived as a respected free man in Virginia. But after his death in 1670, the colonial court ruled that a black man could not be a true citizen of the colony, and his land was seized. Even a man who had done everything right, worked hard, built wealth, obeyed the law, was ultimately denied equality. The rules of the game had changed. Freedom was no longer something an African could truly claim. The shift wasn't just about law, it was about money. As tobacco profits soared, the demand for cheap, permanent labor exploded. Indentured servants were costly to transport and only worked a few years before claiming their freedom. Africans, by contrast, could be enslaved for life, and their children after them. To the planters, this meant generational labor. It meant security. It meant wealth. Across the Atlantic, powerful networks made this possible. English merchants began to join the transatlantic slave trade, buying captives from African traders, shipping them through the brutal Middle Passage, and selling them in the Americas. By the 1660s, English ports like Bristol and London were profiting heavily from the trade. The triangular pattern was set: goods from Europe to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, and colonial products, tobacco, sugar, rice, back to Europe. It was the beginning of a global economy built on human misery. In 1661, the island of Barbados, another English colony, passed one of the first comprehensive slave codes. It spelled out in cold, brutal detail that enslaved Africans were chattel, property with no rights, to be controlled through violence and fear. 2 years later, Virginia followed suit. Laws in the 1660s and 1670s began to lock racial slavery into place. In 1662, Virginia declared that a child's status would follow the condition of the mother. If the mother was enslaved, the child would be enslaved too. This law broke centuries of English custom and created a self-replicating system of bondage. In 1667, the colony decided that baptism did not change a person's status: Christian or not, an enslaved person remained enslaved. Religion could no longer be a pathway to freedom. By 1670, Africans and Native Americans were banned from owning servants of their own race. And after 1676, following the turmoil of Bacon's Rebellion, new laws would seal the racial hierarchy for good. Let's pause on Bacon's Rebellion, because it was a turning point. In 1676, a young planter named Nathaniel Bacon led a violent uprising of poor farmers, servants, and frontier settlers against the colonial elite. They were angry at high taxes, corrupt leadership, and conflicts with native tribes. For a brief moment, black and white laborers, bound together by their poverty, rose side by side against the ruling class. But when the rebellion collapsed, the planters learned a crucial lesson: if poor whites and blacks united, the system could fall apart. So the elite began to draw sharper racial lines. They gave poor whites small privileges, land, guns, and the right to vote, while tightening the chains on Africans. Whiteness became a badge of status, blackness became a mark of bondage. Division became a tool of control. The rebellion's ashes gave birth to a new social order, one that would define America's next 2 centuries. By the 1680s, Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas were full-fledged slave societies. Ship after ship brought Africans by the hundreds. They came from diverse nations, Congo, Igbo, Yoruba, Akan, speaking dozens of languages. Torn from their homelands, they were thrown together in fields, kitchens, and workshops. The planters gave them new names, banned their native languages, and tried to erase their past. But culture has a way of surviving. Even under the whip, enslaved Africans kept fragments of their heritage alive, rhythms, songs, stories, spiritual beliefs. Out of that mix, something new was forming, the beginnings of African American culture. Life for the enslaved was harsh beyond measure. They worked from sunrise to sunset under the blazing sun, planting, cutting, and curing tobacco. Punishments were public and cruel, whippings, shackles, branding. Women faced the added horror of sexual exploitation, their children born into slavery before they could even take their first breath. Some resisted in small, quiet ways, breaking tools, slowing their work, or stealing food. Others risked everything to escape into the wilderness, sometimes finding refuge with native communities or maroon settlements deep in the swamps. A few revolted openly, though such uprisings were rare and often ended in bloodshed. Still, the spirit of defiance never died. Across the ocean, in England, few people wanted to see what was really happening. The slave trade was making the empire rich. Ships built in Liverpool and Bristol carried chains and guns to Africa, human cargo to the Caribbean, and sugar and tobacco back home. Investors and merchants grew wealthy. Even universities and churches took profits from the trade. The moral cost was invisible, at least to those who benefited. But in the colonies, the consequences were everywhere. By the end of the 1600s, the population of enslaved Africans in Virginia had grown from a few dozen to thousands. The transformation was complete. What began as a colony of farmers and adventurers had become a slave society, where human bondage was the foundation of wealth and power. There is something haunting about this moment in history. The very same men who talked about freedom and self-government were building fortunes on slavery. When they gathered in their local assemblies to discuss liberty, their fields were filled with people who had none. They justified it with scripture, with pseudoscience, with the argument that Africans were naturally suited for labor. And yet, they could not fully silence the contradictions that were growing in their own hearts. Slavery was becoming the American paradox, freedom for some, bondage for others. By 1700, the colonies were divided into 2 worlds. In the north, slavery existed but remained limited, used mostly in households and small farms. In the south, it had become the backbone of the economy. Plantations stretched across Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas, their wealth measured in acres of land and the number of enslaved people owned. The Africans brought there had transformed from a handful of captives in 1619 to a population of tens of thousands. They spoke new languages, English mixed with African rhythms and words. They practiced Christianity but blended it with their ancestral spirituality. They built families and communities, even within bondage. Their resilience was a quiet rebellion, a declaration of humanity in a system built to deny it. So, as the 17th century closed, America stood at a crossroads. The dream of liberty, born in Jamestown and nurtured in the House of Burgesses, was now tied to a nightmare of human enslavement. The contradiction would grow deeper with every generation, until it tore the nation apart. In the next part of our story, we'll move into the 18th century, when slavery expanded across the colonies, fueling the rise of a powerful economy and shaping every corner of early America. We'll see how African culture took root, how resistance continued, and how the struggle for freedom began long before the first shot of the revolution was fired. Part 3, The Expansion of Slavery and the Birth of African America, 1700 to 1776. By the dawn of the 1700s, the 13 English colonies along the Atlantic coast were no longer fragile experiments. They were thriving societies, ports bustling with ships, towns humming with trade, plantations stretching as far as the eye could see. But beneath that prosperity lay the beating heart of an inhuman system. Slavery was no longer an accident or an exception, it was the engine that powered colonial America. Across Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas, fields of tobacco, rice, and indigo demanded endless labor. The answer came from Africa. Ships carrying hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children crossed the Atlantic every month. The numbers were staggering. Between 1700 and 1776, nearly 300,000 Africans were brought to the mainland British colonies. What had begun in 1619 with a few dozen captives was now a vast, brutal machine of human trafficking. When we think of colonial America, we often picture white settlers, farmers, merchants, preachers, building a new life in the wilderness. But behind every image of progress stood the enslaved. On plantations they planted, harvested, and processed crops from sunrise to sunset. In cities like Charleston, New York, and Boston, they worked as dockhands, blacksmiths, cooks, and carpenters. Even families that owned only one or two enslaved people relied on their labor for comfort and survival. By 1750, 1 in 5 people in the American colonies was of African descent. In the South, that number was far higher, sometimes more than half the population. The land of opportunity was becoming a land of bondage. Let's travel for a moment to South Carolina, around 1730. The low, humid coastal plains were ideal for rice cultivation, but deadly to work in. Planters there had discovered that Africans from the Senegambia and Sierra Leone regions possessed deep knowledge of rice farming, irrigation, and pest control. Enslaved Africans became not just workers but uncredited experts, turning swamps into gold mines for their masters. The work was brutal, standing for hours in ankle-deep water under a burning sun, battling mosquitoes, snakes, and disease. Yet out of that horror grew one of the most distinct African American cultures in early America, the Gullah Geechee people of the Carolina and Georgia coasts. Because of the isolation of the rice plantations, enslaved Africans there preserved more of their language, traditions, and spiritual practices than almost anywhere else. They wove baskets in West African styles, spoke a Creole that blended English with African words, and sang call and response songs that carried hidden meanings. Even under oppression, they built something new, a culture that endures to this day. In Virginia and Maryland, tobacco still ruled. Enslaved people worked in gangs under the constant eye of overseers. The rhythm of their lives followed the crop, planting in spring, cutting and curing in fall. Sundays were often their only day of rest, a time to gather, worship, sing, and share stories. It was then that African traditions blended with Christianity, creating spirituals, songs of sorrow, hope, and coded messages of freedom. The enslaved found ways to resist. Some slowed their pace, broke tools, or pretended illness. Others ran away into the forests or joined maroon communities, hidden settlements of escaped slaves and Native Americans. A few led uprisings that shook the colonies. One of the largest early revolts occurred in 1739, the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina. Early one September morning, a group of enslaved Africans, many of them from Angola, broke into a store, seized weapons, and marched toward Spanish Florida, where freedom was promised to fugitives. They carried banners that read, "Liberty," and chanted the same word as they moved. Along the way, they burned plantations and killed slaveholders. The rebellion was crushed within days, dozens were killed, their heads displayed on spikes along the road. But the message was clear, the desire for freedom could not be chained. The rebellion terrified white colonists. In response, South Carolina passed the Slave Code of 1740, one of the harshest sets of laws in North America. It banned enslaved people from assembling in groups, learning to read, earning money, or moving without permission. Across the colonies, similar codes tightened control, turning fear into law. Yet, as repression grew, so did the sense of community among the enslaved. They found strength in family, faith, and shared memory. Even when husbands and wives were sold apart, kinship networks endured. They became each other's support systems, grandmothers raising children, friends becoming family. Within bondage, they created a world of resilience and love. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the British Empire was booming. The slave trade had become one of its most profitable industries. Ships left London, Bristol, and Liverpool laden with guns, cloth, and rum. They sailed to the African coast, traded these goods for captives, then crossed the ocean in the infamous Middle Passage, a journey that could last 2 or 3 months. The ships were floating prisons. Hundreds of men, women, and children were chained below deck in spaces so tight they could barely move. Disease spread rapidly. Some died of dysentery or smallpox, others jumped overboard rather than face a life of enslavement. Historians estimate that between 12 and 13 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic during the slave trade, and that nearly 2 million died on the voyage. Every successful crossing was an act of survival. Every living soul who stepped off a slave ship carried trauma, and hope, across an ocean. In the northern colonies, slavery looked different but was no less real. In cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Newport, enslaved people built roads, hauled cargo, and worked as servants. Some were hired out to earn wages for their masters, others lived in small quarters behind elegant homes. Northern slavery was smaller in scale, but it helped fuel the region's growing wealth. Merchants who shipped fish, lumber, and rum to the Caribbean made fortunes that depended on slave-grown sugar and molasses. Even in places that prided themselves on freedom, slavery was part of daily life. In 1711, New York City established an official slave market on Wall Street. In 1741, after a series of mysterious fires, the city executed or deported dozens of black men accused, without real evidence, of plotting a revolt. The fear of rebellion haunted every colony, North and South alike. By the 1750s, the children and grandchildren of those first Africans had built something extraordinary, a new people, a distinct African American identity. They spoke English, worshipped in their own way, and dreamed of freedom even when it seemed impossible. They carried Africa in their music, their food, their names, and their spirit. In Virginia, enslaved black preachers began holding secret gatherings in the woods, blending African rhythms with Christian hymns. The seeds of a spiritual revolution were planted. In northern towns, free black communities were forming, small but determined. They worked as sailors, craftsmen, and laborers. Some even owned property or small businesses. But they all lived under the shadow of laws that marked them as second class. Then came the 1750s and 1760s, the era of revolution. Colonists began to speak of liberty and natural rights. Pamphlets proclaimed that all men are created equal. British taxes and imperial control enraged the colonists, who saw themselves as victims of tyranny. But for enslaved Africans, these cries for freedom rang with painful irony. How could a people who held others in chains demand liberty for themselves? Some enslaved men and women used the rhetoric of the revolution to their advantage. They filed petitions for freedom, arguing that if liberty was a God-given right, then it must belong to them too. Others ran away to join the British Army when it promised emancipation to those who fled rebel masters. For the enslaved, every spark of political upheaval was also a spark of hope. By 1776, the year of American independence, nearly 500,000 Africans and African Americans lived in the colonies. Their labor had built the economy, their suffering had financed the dream of liberty, and their culture had begun to shape the soul of a new nation. When the Declaration of Independence was signed, its promise, "All men are created equal," was both a triumph and a lie. Enslaved people heard those words and held them close, waiting for the day they would finally be true. Let's end this story where it began, on the shores of Virginia. More than 150 years had passed since that small ship, the White Lion, brought the first Africans to Point Comfort. In that time, generations had lived and died in bondage. Yet through it all, they had created something indestructible, the foundation of Black America. Their hands built the fields, the roads, the cities. Their voices gave birth to songs of sorrow and faith that would one day fuel freedom movements. Their struggle forced the nation to face its greatest contradiction: how could a country founded on liberty survive with slavery at its core? The answer would come later, in war, in emancipation, in the long fight for civil rights. But it all began here, in the 1600s and 1700s, with the men and women whose names history almost forgot. They were the first Africans in America. And their story is not one of despair, but of endurance. Through chains, through silence, through centuries, they carried with them the first breath of freedom that would one day define the American soul. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads.